Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Thank you for joining me this evening.
It's good to be back. It's good to be with you today. Wish I was in the studio in the new setup, but I will make do with my usual digital foray into Novara Live this evening.
Yeah, we need a head-to-head in person soon. We are actually going to, I think we disagree on the final story tonight, although I don't think it's not necessarily going to be the most heated of arguments. I think the ban on social media for under 16s in Australia is brilliant. And I've seen from a video you've posted on social media, Helena, that you don't. So you can look forward to that. I suppose while you're watching, work out what side you're going to be on. The other stories we are discussing tonight are Labour aren't meeting their housing targets. Why not? There are Palestine Action prisoners currently on hunger strike. They've been visited by Jeremy Corbyn. We have an interview with him. And Starmer is our top story. He wants tougher policing of Europe's borders and reforms of the ECHR. Yes. I was getting confused between the ECHR and the EHRC, but it is the ECHR. I shouldn't have second-guessed the script. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support, and do make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. The European Convention on Human Rights has long been a target for right-wing parties in the UK. The Tories blamed it for blocking their Rwanda deportation scheme and threatened to withdraw the UK from it. And Reform UK has said they'll bin it if they gain power, citing it as a major impediment to tackling rising migration to the UK. But Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer committed his government to a different path on migration when he took power last year.
There is no need to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. That is not consistent with the values of that blood bond, and so we won't withdraw, not now, not ever.
That was a pledge not to withdraw from the ECHR, but it wasn't a promise not to change it. And today, European justice ministers from the 46 countries signed up to the ECHR have agreed to negotiate a new approach to how European human rights law is interpreted. That's in a bid to tackle migration to the continent, or especially irregular migration to the continent. Now, that new approach has been championed by Starmer and Justice Secretary David Lammy, with the two working behind the scenes to build consensus across Europe. And last night, writing alongside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, in The Guardian, Starmer argued that allowing a harsher legal response to immigration was the only way to stop right-wing populist governments taking power and threatening democracy itself across Europe. Now, in that piece, the two prime ministers wrote this: "The current asylum framework was created for another era. In a world with mass mobility, yesterday's answers do not work. We will always protect those fleeing war and terror, but the world has changed and asylum systems must change with it. Today, millions are on the move, not only because their lives are in danger, but because they want a better future. If we fail to take account of this, we would fail the needs of genuine refugees and the communities that for too long have been asked to absorb rapid change. For decades, citizens in our countries have demanded action, so we are acting, not to exploit these issues and stoke grievances, as some do, but to find real solutions. The best way of fighting against the forces of hate and division is to show that mainstream progressive politics can fix this problem." Ahead of the meeting in Strasbourg today, David Lammy spoke to reporters.
I'm very pleased that the initial conversations that I've had with now well over 20 member states is demonstrating that on the way that some of these issues have been interpreted in member countries, we can achieve consensus and we can arrive at a political declaration that chimes with our respective populations.
So what exactly have the ministers agreed? Well, it's rather technical. They haven't asked for the ECHR to be rewritten, at least not yet, but they have agreed to negotiate a new political declaration to be adopted at a summit next May. And that declaration would provide judges in European courts with guidance over how certain parts of the ECHR should be understood. And that's with the goal of speeding up the deportation of asylum seekers whose claims have failed or who have gone on to commit crimes. One way of doing this would be to restrict the way the law is currently applied. As early as March this year, the government began making a series of announcements on its plans to curb Article 8 of the Convention, which guarantees a right to family life. But the government is also reported to have argued for a weakening of Article 3, which protects against torture and inhumane or degrading treatment. And that's led to protests from human rights groups earlier this week. In a policy document released last month, the government said this about Article 3. The interpretation of inhumane or degrading treatment has been expanded over time. As a consequence, we see examples of foreign national offenders who are being able to stay in the UK on the basis of an Article 3 protection claim, despite committing serious criminal offences in the UK. Others have blocked a deportation because their healthcare needs, including mental health care, cannot be fully met in their country of origin. So that's from the Government Asylum and Returns Policy Statement. We won't know what political statement European politicians agree to until next year, but what kind of impact is reforming the ECHR likely to have on British immigration measures? Well, when it comes to appeals against failed asylum claims, it could be significant. This is from a House of Commons library briefing from October. So they said from 2015 to 2014, immigration judges granted 61,000 out of the 115,000 human rights appeals brought against the Home Office. So if this rereading of the ECHR would make less of those appeals successful, that would presumably mean less of those grants would be given out. The impact on cases involving the deportation of foreign nationals who commit crimes is likely to be less because they already generally get rejected more often. So this is from that same briefing. From August 2018 to October 2019, the Home Office win rate in ECHR appeals against criminal deportation ranged between 65% and 75%. And from 2015 to 2020, the Home Office win rate in all first-tier tribunal appeals against deportation was 70%. Of the appeals won by the person contesting deportation, around 1,000 were successful on ECHR grounds only, although some of the other 1,500 appeals won by migrants may have been a mix of ECHR and non-ECHR reasons. It goes on, in the same 2015-16 to 2020-21 period, the Home Office removed 31,000 foreign national offenders from the UK. The 1,000 foreign criminals able to block deportation on ECHR grounds alone represent 3% of that figure. So as you can see, less significant because it seems like it's easier to deport someone who has committed a crime. Although you get all those headlines, don't you, that this person committed this crime but then wasn't able to be deported because their kid liked chicken nuggets. That was the big headline in the Telegraph earlier this year. Apparently that was rejected anyway. It just shouldn't have ever got written down by the judge, but there we are. Of course, the government would argue that tightening the ECHR isn't just about increasing deportations, but creating a deterrent against migrants trying to come to the UK in the first place, especially asylum seekers trying to come by irregular routes. And in his piece in The Guardian, Starmer was explicit that changing how the ECHR works isn't just about justice, but about politics too. It's being framed as a bid to capture some of reform's political ground, and that's prompted a fair amount of reaction from the left. So Labour MP Clive Lewis posted this: "Genius! The PM's big plan to stop the far right, ask Europe to gut the ECHR, our last line of defence against torture, tyranny and despotism, because nothing says defend democracy like burning your bows on the eve of battle so you can stay warm for one more night." Andrew Feinstein, who reduced Keir Starmer's constituency majority when he ran against him at last year's general election, could well beat him at the next general election. He said this: "Keir Starmer has called on European leaders to urgently curb joint human rights laws so that member states can take tougher action to protect their borders and see off the rise of the populist right across the continent. He's a effing human rights lawyer." Yeah, apparently he wrote the textbook on the ECHR, Keir Starmer, so I don't think he probably ever saw himself as going to Europe to try and water it down. Carla Denyer, former Green Party leader, said, "Happy Human Rights Day." I didn't know it was Human Rights Day. Starmer has chosen to mark it by kicking off negotiations on how to water down our human rights. The ECHR protects all of us, so we should all be worried about changes that amount to human rights, except for those people. Denyer is, of course, right that the ECHR is not a set of laws that is only used by migrants or people who aren't citizens of European countries, and changing their application may have unintended consequences for us all. So I suppose to give one example, in 2024, a broad interpretation of Article 8 was central to a European Court of Human Rights judgment that obligated the 46 member states to mitigate against climate change or face potentially massive lawsuits. Helena, what's your opinion on this?
I mean, so first of all, when it comes to things like the expanding interpretations of some definitions, I have a lot of sympathy with this argument, right? When it comes to like the inhumane or degrading treatment and expanding that to, well, if we send this person back to XYZ country after they've committed a crime and their particular health condition isn't treated as well there as it is here, I think that is potentially too far of an expanding of that definition. So people asking for clarifications of the way that it is already written to take the spirit of what has already been written into these pieces of human rights legislation and make clarifying statements about what certain things that are open to interpretation mean without actually rewriting any of it. I have some sympathy with these arguments because that's not actually about removing people's rights. It's about ensuring that the way it is codified actually makes sense in terms of what the actual intention of the original legislation was, and open the way in which we found ourselves in a position where there are some cases where it seems like it's unjustifiable that if, for example, a deportation has been stopped for a foreign criminal because of reasons that are not necessarily in the original scope of that legislation. I think that's a reasonable thing to look at because it's not actually taking away people's human rights. It's ensuring that the actual letter of what is being applied makes sense within the context. The difference comes when you're looking to actually curb the current freedoms that people have under those conventions by wanting to go back and rewrite it, which, as we've seen, it looks like this government does want to do. To try and recapture ground from the populist right, i.e. essentially cede to a lot of their positions on this, which is that, well, it doesn't matter if we curb these rights for the people who are in the in-group, the only people who actually see the poor end of this is going to be the out-group, so everything's fine. That is essentially the populist right position, because as a kind of, from a conservative viewpoint where you look at state overreach, you look at any kind of, whether it's public or private overreach, you only ever look at it as if it's only the out-group that will be the ones that are affected by it. The populist right are very heavy on things like law and order, but they never expect that it will be turned inwards rather than only be used outwards. And that's why universality of human rights is so important, and why trying to buy into that rhetoric for people who will call themselves at the very least on the progressive side of politics is going to be a hide into nothing. There are plenty of things, for example, when they say they want to curb such things as Article 8 of the ECHR, which is the right to not just a family life, but a private family life. Well, we all know how this current government feels about privacy, but this current government feels about our civil liberties when it comes to things like the right to protest, or the privacy when it comes to things such as identification, when it comes to the ID cards bill, which is overwhelmingly opposed by huge amounts of the population, to the point at which 3 million of them signed a petition, which saw kind of unilateral condemnation in a debate in the Houses of Parliament on Monday. Significant opposition to such legislation coming from all sides, including from the government's own backbenches. So it's clear to me that anybody who thinks that removing some provisions from Article 8 will only be used against the bad out-group, again, that's their framing, not mine, and would not be used against the in-group when it's clear this government has already seen that they would be open to those kind of uses of state power, is cutting off your nose to spite your face more broadly. So I would be worried. This government has shown they're very happy to engage in authoritarianism, and justifying it through the idea that, well, it's necessary to be able to curb asylum, rather than talk about how we can fix the asylum system without having to water down the human rights for the current population of the UK. That would be a position that I would want to accept. But it's clear to me that any lever can be used by this government, regardless of the negative consequences or negative externalities further down the line, if it meets their short-term political aims. And it's that kind of government that we should be worried about.
The argument that these guys would make, and most of Europe is currently led by centrist governments who have the populist right like hot on their heels, is to say the one main wedge issue for the populist right is irregular migration. That's one of the things that seems to be really helping them in the polls. People might argue that's why the far right in Denmark haven't been quite as successful, because the centre sort of solved that, for want of a better term, or came closer to what the general public's attitude and desire was. And if liberals or centrists refuse to move in that direction, then you let in sort of populist right-wingers who might have a much more expansive project than merely reducing the number of irregular migrants that come to Europe. So I suppose, do you think there's something to that? Because, people are saying, well, we might as well just have a reform if Labour are going to be doing this. But reform would do a lot more than trying to renegotiate the ECHR, so it would be harder for irregular migrants to come to the country, right? So are they correct as these sort of centrist governments to say, at this point in time, we really do have to meet the electorate where they are on this, otherwise the whole sort of liberal centrist project is going to collapse. And, we would like it to be replaced by the populist left, but it seems much more likely that it would be replaced by the populist right at this point in time.
I mean, I just think that the ground that's being ceded won't stem that tide. The kind of people who the populist right are appealing to are the kind of people who don't want any asylum claims at all. It seems like half measures which water down our rights whilst not actually kind of satisfying the demands of the voter base of the populist right. Again, you speak to people like Zia Yusuf or Nigel Farage, and their point of view is no asylum claims for anybody arriving via regular means whatsoever. It's not actually about curbing the number of people who come here. As far as they are concerned, the only deterrent that would work would be shutting down all asylum claims for anybody who arrives via irregular means, which would, again, mostly be against at least the spirit of the Refugee Convention, but the letter of the Refugee Convention. That's the kind of policy that these people want to see. And I don't think saying, well, we'll still allow irregular migrants to come here and claim asylum, but we're going to remove some human rights that stops like 7 people being deported, because it is actually not a huge number, as you've seen from the figures, of people who actually have their claims of deportation stopped under ECHR claims, very specifically the things that they're looking at trying to modify, or like solely ECHR claims rather than at least partially ECHR claims. It's not actually going to reduce by a huge amount the number of people who actually stop their deportations when, again, as I said, like the populist right, what they want to see and what their voter base wants to see, and the kind of people that Labour would be able to peel back, or if they did do something, but they would need to go much further than the kind of stuff that they're offering up right now, which what they're offering here is the worst of all worlds, where the rights for people in the UK get watered down. We don't actually see a huge drop in asylum claims or asylum deportations, because mostly, as we've seen from the figures from Migration Observatory, changes in internal policy don't act as much of a deterrent, but unless you actually be closing the borders completely, kind of Operation Sovereign Border style, which I don't think anybody on the progressive left really wants to do, then these people aren't going to get peeled over anyway. So the populist right will still win, and then there'll be a framework in place for the populist right to do even worse than they would do if there was a kind of a constitutional barrier for them doing so beforehand.
All right, let's move on from asylum to something even more divisive. The government's attempt to change the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights comes quickly after Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood launched a new inquiry into grooming gangs on Tuesday.
The inquiry is focused specifically on child sexual abuse committed by grooming gangs. It will consider explicitly the background of offenders, including their ethnicity and religion, and whether the authorities failed to properly investigate what happened out of a misplaced desire to protect community cohesion. The inquiry will act without fear or favour, identifying individual, institutional and systemic failure.
The inquiry will be chaired by Anne Longfield, a Labour peer who formerly headed the Children's Commission in England. The most controversial aspect of the inquiry is the focus on the ethnicity of the perpetrators involved. And Home Office Minister Mike Tapp really leaned into that point when speaking to GB News.
But it's also very important. And what we won't do is turn away from this, and it's about ensuring that if there is a link between ethnicity, between race, between culture, that we identify that so that we can deal with it, whether it's because one of the reasons that the perpetrators are committing this crime, or one of the reasons that some have turned away from it. We need to get to the bottom of it, and I'm confident we will.
So some found that statement from Tapp pretty shocking. This was from friend of the show, Owen Jones. He said, he quoted what he'd said and then said, "This is a Labour minister, what the F?" Zach Polanski says, an immigration minister for the Labour Party, they believe in nothing and just parrot Nigel Farage. And Tommy Robinson, podcaster Jimmy the Giant, who we've had on Downstream, said, Labour MP Mike Tapp pontificating over whether race causes crime. Let that sink in. This is where we are now. Now, I think it is fair to say that by linking race and crime, Mike Tapp definitely was dabbling in the language of the far right. However, by talking about ethnicity, culture, and this particular crime, he was actually just echoing a recent government report by Louise Casey, which sort of, as far as I could tell, was pretty broadly welcomed. So Casey's audit into the grooming gangs cases was released in June. In it, she said this: Despite the lack of a full picture in the national data sets, there is enough evidence available in local police data in free police force areas, which we examined, which show disproportionate numbers of men from Asian ethnic backgrounds amongst suspects for group-based child sexual exploitation, as well as in a significant number of perpetrators of Asian ethnicity identified in local reviews and high-profile child sexual exploitation prosecutions across the country. To at least warrant further examination, she said more effort is required to identify the nature of group-based child sexual exploitation and, in particular, the ethnicity of perpetrators and offender motivations in order to understand it better and to tackle it more effectively. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has also made a similar argument for better recording the ethnicity of perpetrators of crime. So she said this: "It is my view that we should collect ethnicity data for all offences because the best way to deal with suggestions of a conspiracy is to have transparency and accurate data that puts all those claims and counterclaims to bed." Of course, even if you don't bring race into it like Mike Tapp did, issues around culture and crime, obviously explosive, should be dealt with incredibly sensitively because there are a lot of people that want to exploit this to sort of horrific ends. But for those who do want to draw such links, and there are many, free headlines have been circulated very widely this week. So in Bristol, a teenage boy and 3 men have been charged with the rape and exploitation of a girl in Bristol. 2 of those men have been described as Afghan nationals, while the ethnicities of the other man and the boy have not been released. In Bolton, a 28-year-old Afghan national has been charged with the rape of 2 teenage girls over the past weekend. And then on Tuesday, 2 17-year-old Afghan asylum seekers were handed lengthy custodial sentences for raping a 15-year-old girl they'd pretended to befriend, with CCTV footage showing them dragging her into bushes before the attack. Speaking to The Times, the barrister for one of those 2 boys emphasised the role that culture may have played in this attack. So this is from the barrister. "There are cultural differences. He is not used to a society where women are free and deemed equal to men. He is not used to a society where alcohol is freely available. He is morally at sea. There are massive cultural barriers that have become massive moral barriers." So that was the barrister's defence, is to say that, culturally he's from a society where women and men aren't deemed to be equal. Helena, obviously a very, very sensitive topic. Obviously lots of people want to weaponize this in quite a damaging way. I suppose one thing I find here is I find the sort of confidence on both sides a little bit misplaced in a way, to say it can't possibly have anything to do with cultural background, or the only thing that really is a threat to women in this country is people from other countries, which is obviously a racist, ridiculous position. But I do think that, on the left, when sexual abuse happens, often what's invoked is rape culture, right? People don't say, well, this is just inherent and natural for men to do this. It will always be there, so we've just got to get used to it, or have very, very heavy policing. People invoke culture. And if you're invoking rape culture, then you do have to accept that cultures in different places are going to have different attitudes to rape, right? I mean, and I suppose the real danger here is that then people say, well, all Afghans are rapists, which is obviously not true and would be like a hideously offensive, discriminatory thing to think or believe. But the idea that sort of this has nothing to do with it when you've got people who've just arrived from a very patriarchal society seems to me a little bit naive. I don't know, where are you on this?
I mean, this is a failure of state capacity in my mind, especially with the case when it came to those asylum seekers, right? I think I would agree with kind of the point that you made there, about, the cultural impacts can have a kind of determining factor into how likely these things are to happen. And I would agree that if we can make the claim that we live in this country in a rape culture, then those things can exist in a greater extent in other countries as well. And if people don't, when they move from culture to culture, change their opinions or are at least educated in the ways in which the culture will be different in the country that they move to, then these things can be more likely to happen. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. When it comes to asylum seekers, right, like this is why we need to have a properly functioning asylum system that hasn't been gone through 15 years of austerity. And we can look at models that do show really good models of integration, like you see in Norway, where they do have very kind of comprehensive kind of cultural education before they're getting put into the wider population. They do have all of these different systems in place to ensure that before they are just being let out to the population willy-nilly, they've gone through a bunch of this cultural assimilation education. I think that's a good policy, rather than just throwing them in hotels as we are now, letting them fend for themselves, which is basically where we're at in this country with state capacity stripped back so much. We are leaving ourselves open to these things happening if we don't have systems in place to prevent it, which seems to be the big problem. I think Shabana Mahmood's point, probably pretty reasonable too. This idea that, well, if we know in ourselves that there isn't an ethnic component to this, there isn't a racial component to this, then we should be happy to look at the figures to be able to prove that that is the case. We should be able to have independent people do peer-reviewed information on this to be able to go to the public and say, you all thought that it was just because there was the color of their skin or the ethnicity of the person that was the determining factor in their propensity for sexual assault or for violence. And we have the data now and we show that you're wrong. Like, we can't be able to say these things if all we're doing is going, well, you can't look at it. You can't look at this data because everyone thinks, oh, well, you don't want us to look at the data because you think that it will prove you wrong, right? Whereas if we're right, the data will show that we're correct. Because we've already seen, in an absence of that data, we've already seen malicious actors try and fill that space with worse data. For example, there was a report that came out from the Centre for Migration Control, which is essentially just one guy affiliated to Reform UK, who put out statistics showing that Afghans had a much higher propensity for crimes than native British people. And it came out with this very high number because they had massively underestimated the actual population of Afghans in this country. And if you corrected that to being actual number, it meant that this huge disparity, didn't exist in the way that was being purported to by these figures. And again, they're in this position where they can do this because we don't have proper figures to be able to debunk it from first principles and are just going on our own kind of what we've iterated ourselves rather than from hard data. And so that's why I think Mahmood's position probably perfectly reasonable to advocate for. As I mean myself, when it comes to the asylum system, we just need to have a really rigorous cultural education program, English lessons, all that kind of stuff. But we don't have that because we've stripped all the funding away from the system because of 15 years of George Osborneism.
Politics in Britain is pretty polarised, but there's one thing most people can agree on. We need to build more homes.
It's time to get Britain building again. It's time to build 1.5 million new homes across the country. Opportunities for first-time buyers in every community. New development corporations with the power to remove the blockages. New infrastructure to support families and communities to grow.
That was Keir Starmer's last party conference speech as leader of the opposition. And the Housing Secretary now has come up with his own slogan to summarise Labour's priorities. So they were all wearing caps. You couldn't see it because they're a bit small there, but the caps say build, baby, build, and they're supposed to look like make America great again. Labour has a problem, though. To build 1.5 million homes over the course of a parliament, we'd need an average of 300,000 homes built every year. So how many have we built in the past 12 months? Well, only 139,000, so less than half the target. And what's even worse, it's actually down from the 200,000 homes built in the final year the Tories were in power. So that doesn't look good. Speaking to the BBC, Steve Reid has admitted the obvious. So this is a headline from the BBC this week. Minister admits sharp rise needed to hit 1.5 million housing target. Fairly obvious. And this is from that article. So he says, this is in the voice of the journalist, isn't it? Reid, who took over the housing brief 3 months ago from Angela Rayner, said the government always expected the big increase to come in the latter part of this parliament. I've heard it described as a hockey stick, because it is a relatively gentle increase until it shoots up towards the end. Now, you want it to look like a hockey stick. We've got no idea if it's going to look like a hockey stick. If it does, that would be great. Reid insisted the government had already put in place huge changes to increase house building, such as the Planning and Infrastructure Bill currently in its final stages in Parliament, which he said would dramatically speed up decision-making. A major part of the plan is to make it easier to approve homes near public transport, which Reid claimed could be worth 1 million homes on its own. Of course, you need someone to build those homes. So is Steve Reid right? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Charlie Winstanley, former political advisor to the Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who also worked on housing under Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham. Paul Dennett was a deputy mayor, I think he probably still is. Charlie Winstanley has just published the book Bricking It, the UK Housing Crisis and the Failure of Policy. And I started by asking him why Labour were currently missing their own targets.
I just jump back to the actual promise of 1.5 million homes. So I think this is often kind of reported on as being Labour's promise on the incoming government, but this promise actually originated, I think, around 2014. It was a long time ago, under the previous Tory administration, when effectively like an unhypothecated sort of number was plucked out of the air for the purpose of the election campaigns, 300,000 homes a year, which was then institutionalised into the National Planning Policy Framework, which I think was introduced in about 2012, and then imposed as a kind of a target for local authorities to build towards through the quote-unquote objectively assessed housing need, which was introduced for that period of time. And then it fell apart towards the end of the Tory administration, primarily because of political difficulties within the Tory party at imposing these targets on home county authorities. And throughout the entire period of the previous government, they failed to hit these targets as well. So I think there's some prehistory on this number, this 1.5 million number. And to a certain extent, I was a bit surprised when they resuscitated it, because there are a lot of very big reasons why we're not hitting that scale of house building in the current period. One of them is that local authorities that used to produce between thirds to half of all the new house building completions for much of the 20th century are no longer effectively in the housing market building council housing. And that's a huge reason why that it's unable to ramp up to those numbers. Another reason is, quite frankly, in the construction sector right now, there is a massive labour shortage of up to about 250,000 construction workers. So as a prerequisite to sort of ramping up to the kind of figures which you'd be required to get to the 1.5 million over the course of the Parliament, that's a sort of a prerequisite problem to deal with up front, which really needs to be gotten ahead of. There's also obviously issues with interest rate rises and the impact that that's had on the demand for mortgages and thus demand for new house building. And there are also some endemic problems in our over-reliance on volume developers for the majority of the housing supply. So I mentioned the collapse of local authorities as a sector of the construction sector. The other sector of the construction sector which collapsed is small and medium enterprises, who collapsed to around, I think off the top of my head, around a third of their previous size before 2008 in terms of their delivery. And the overwhelming number of homes now in the UK are being produced by volume developers who are working on large sites. Do I think realistically government is on target to hit those 1.5 million homes? No, and I don't speak to many people who have anything to do with the sector or construction who do.
Yeah, I hear about that volume house builder point quite a lot, which is sort of because there's so few firms who can do this building, that means that they can act, I suppose, oligopolistically to limit production to keep prices high. If it was this market with perfect competition where you had loads and loads of different house builders, maybe they wouldn't have sort of the market power to do that kind of thing, and they would, it would be in each of their interests to just produce as many houses as they possibly could. I suppose the argument people in favour of planning reform make is they say that one of the reasons why the sort of industry favours the big house builders is because they're the only ones who have enough money to get the planning permission and take the risks that this might get rejected or appealed. Do you not buy that?
Up to a point, that's right. It's right that to a certain extent, the large builders are able to compete in the market. They're able to, value engineer their products to a point where it's far more price competitive relative to, say, an average SME. They're able to do lots of things which can bring down the value of their units to a more affordable level than, say, your average SME. So there's an element of that, and including being able to box off very different stipulations. But I think looking at the actual time frame in which the numbers of SMEs really collapsed, it collapsed right after the financial crisis. I think what we see more than anything isn't a fundamental inability of SMEs to just absorb the costs of regulation and planning system. I think what you've seen actually is just a timing issue where during the financial crisis, finance contracted, many of them went out of business. And now for them to muscle their way back into the market, having basically been decimated, is a very difficult task. So there are undoubtedly things like regulations and planning burdens and bureaucracy play a role in terms of, the viability of particular units and businesses. But fundamentally, do I think that they're the thing which has been responsible for the lack of SMEs in the market today? No, I don't.
Sort of Labour's claim, or Steve Reed's claim, is, we're massively missing the target now, but we've just implemented this planning reform and it's going to take a bit of it's going to take a while for this to filter through the system. And what we're actually going to see is an explosion of new houses being built towards the end of this parliament, which, I don't find particularly convincing. You were a former political advisor to the Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who is the Deputy Mayor to Andy Burnham, the portfolio lead for housing, planning and homelessness. Manchester is often put forward as a bit of a YIMBY paradise. So the people who sort of say the problem is we're not letting enough developers build homes, they say, well, Manchester have done this right. They did build a lot of flats and now it's a better city. Do you back that analysis?
I think it's a much more mixed picture. So I think when you look at what's happened in Manchester, Greater Manchester over the last few decades, I think it's very clear that, let's not try and sugarcoat it. In the 90s, large areas of central Manchester was frankly quite scary places to walk around. My parents were amongst those who fled from Manchester in the 90s because of, we burgled 3 times in a year, moved out to central Lancashire. That's where I grew up for most of my youth. Huge areas of dereliction in the city centre occupied by effectively criminal squats with lots of organised crime. It was very, very different to today. And I think so in terms of the street scene around the city centre and some of the nightlife, etc., I think it's undoubtable that Manchester's seen a visual improvement. I think what's far more questionable when you start breaking down who's been benefiting from these improvements and why, I think it becomes clear that some of what you might call the long-standing residents of Greater Manchester have actually not seen many of those benefits. And many of the outer areas of Greater Manchester continue to live in a lot of relative deprivation. And interestingly, there's quite a lot of research, particularly from LSE, showing how Manchester, in terms of attacking those really long-standing indicators of multiple deprivation, is struggling relatively even compared to its peers. So I think there's some questions about the growth model and who and how it's benefited the residents of Greater Manchester more broadly. I think there is no doubt that the number of units built in Manchester has been high. But I guess the caveat that I would put on that is what kind of unit and for who? What is the political priority and the social priority in terms of house building? And for me, primarily, as a Greater Manchester resident, I'm primarily concerned with residents that currently live here as opposed to those who may live here in future. I'm also mainly concerned with those who I think are struggling the most in terms of the housing market and struggling with affordability and rents, as opposed to those who might not be struggling as much. And I think in terms of Greater Manchester's track record on delivering affordable homes for existing residents and communities, I'd say it's not actually that great.
What was the barrier to doing that? I know Paul Dennett, fairly left-wing socialist guy, Andy Burnham, sort of puts himself forward as fairly progressive. Were they not committed enough to building social housing, or was there some sort of institutional barrier? Actually, to be honest, maybe it's not even within their power in terms of Andy Burnham being a Metro Mayor. But talk to me about that. What was the role of that political unit, the Metro Mayoralty, when it came to social housing or making housing more affordable?
So I think that both Paul and Andy represented a big sea change in Greater Manchester, where for the first time, the issue and the question about the distribution of the benefits of the growth around housing and the wider economy were first started to be drawn into question. But the interesting thing about Greater Manchester, and this is something I go into a little bit in my book Bricking It, which has just been published last year, is it goes back to the 80s, and a man who worked on the Regen team, who would later go on to become the chief executive of Manchester Council, Howard Bernstein, as a Regen officer, created a really ambitious plan and vision for the regeneration of Manchester City Centre and the creation of Manchester City Centre as a destination for both tourism, but also as a centre for a financial and service-based economy, moving away from the industrial economy that we'd had in the past. And there are a long-term and very strategic series of reforms which were enacted throughout the course of the 80s and 90s, which were turbocharged with the IRA bomb in Manchester in the 90s, which destroyed a large part of the city centre and opened it up for huge-scale regeneration and investment. And over a long period of time, Manchester Council, particularly within the Greater Manchester context, had courted an international model of capital investment into building and built infrastructure within the city. So I think when we really started to feel some of the contradictions of this growth model in around 2010 following the financial crisis, and in around 2012 through to 2014, there was an explosion of street homelessness around Greater Manchester. It's partly due to the closure of the homelessness facilities, which had previously been operating for a long time in Manchester city centre. But this was all part of the long-term, very, very long-term approach towards regenerating the city centre of Manchester. So for historical context, Paul was elected in Salford in 2016, and Andy was elected as the GM there the year after. And from that point, sort of building council housing, truly affordable housing, and trying to rein in and seize some of the proceeds as the growth, the economic growth which we had seen in the city region, and distribute those widely, became much more a part of the Greater Manchester political agenda. I guess what I would say is, by that stage, I suppose the tiger had already been let out of the cage, and the growth model which we were then invested in, it had its own legs. So as in the early days, it was very much reliant upon Manchester Council in particular going out and courting international investment. By the time you get into the 2010s, international investors are queuing up to invest in central Manchester, and the most of the land that they're buying is not publicly owned either. So there's very little involvement by this stage of the local authority and it's in the process, having played a very significant role in getting the ball rolling on that kind of model of investment in the first place.
There are currently 8 people on hunger strike in British prisons, all of them detained for many months without ever having been found guilty of a single crime. All have been denied bail for their alleged involvement in Palestine Action raids, either on an arms factory owned by Elbit Systems, that's Israel's largest weapons company, or RAF Bryce Norton, where 2 refueler planes were spray painted. Kessa Zara, Amu Gib, and Heba Muraisi have now been on hunger strike for over 35 days. John Kink, Tuta Hocha and Kamran Ahmed haven't eaten for over 30 days. And Luis Chiaramello has been on strike for 16 days, with Mohamed Umer Khaled joining the action 6 days ago. 5 of the detainees have so far been hospitalised for a period during what is the largest coordinated hunger strike in British prisons since 1981. And of course, that was the year that Bobby Sands and 9 other Irish Republican prisoners died of starvation in a prolonged protest demanding they be recognised as political prisoners. None of the 8 on hunger strike have been charged with terror offences, as their alleged offences all took place before the more recent ban on Palestine Action, but all have complained of arbitrary and demeaning treatment since that prescription came into force. This includes orders stopping them from associating with each other, their removal from employment and education programs, and the confiscation of their kafirs. Remember, none of these people have been convicted of anything. Instead, they have been on prolonged remand, repeatedly denied bail while awaiting trial. Last night, Independent MP and your party co-founder, Jeremy Corbyn, went to visit the hunger strikers at Bronzefield Prison in Surrey, where he described what condition he found the hunger strikers in.
They were very focused, very clear, very understanding of the situation, and I thought in surprisingly positive frame of mind for people that have been through what they've been through for so long. And I found the visit fascinating and uplifting. The sense of the human spirit comes through, that principle. They do not want to be part of the genocide that the people of Palestine are going through, and that's why they're in prison at the present time. What impressed me more than anything is the principles, the determination, to try and do something to stop the disgusting sale of arms to Israel, the manufacture of weapons in Britain which have been used to help Israel achieve the genocide it has in Gaza. And I have a lot of respect for them. And they're taking hunger strike action in order to draw attention to the fact that they are remand prisoners. They're not guilty of anything. They haven't been convicted of anything. They're remand prisoners. Yet the trial date is now set for January 2027. That is 14 months on from now. For people who have a case they want to answer, they want their day in court, obviously, and they'll get that. But why are they in prison at all? They could quite easily be released on remand, and that is one of the requests they've been making. It's a form of protest that people take in prison because, in a sense, it's the last thing they've got. To say, the only thing I've got left in prison is my body, and therefore I will say to you that I'm prepared to damage my own body in order to support the cause that they are campaigning for.
Corbyn also had a message for the media.
There's something quite odd and interesting about this. A number of prisoners taking hunger strike action in this prison gets hardly any coverage on the mainstream media in this country. Now, what has happened to the principle of fearless investigative reporting by the British media? Why can't they report this case? Why can't they make a comment about the unusual nature of being held all this time on remand with apparently little prospect that they'll be released ahead of the trial date, which, as I said, is 14 months away? What's happened to our media? The so-called liberal establishment, I think, is just buttoning down on this and saying that because of the ban on Palestine action, somehow or other they're going to take special pleasure in ensuring these prisoners remain in prison until the trial date. And I discussed with the issue of supply of books and all the sort of petty regulations that go on in prisons. If a prisoner is on remand, then normally they're treated very differently to a convicted prisoner. They've been convicted of nothing.
On Monday, the hunger strikers were also visited by Your Party co-founder Zara Sultana and Labour MP John McDonnell. They've also been frequently visited by loved ones like Nida, who described what impact the hunger strike was having on her friend, Amu Gib.
So firstly, hunger striking is an incredibly legitimate form of protest that Britain is just not used to. And that's why this has been the biggest hunger strike since the 1981 in British prisons. For the first 10 days, you get, like these painful pangs and your stomach kind of hurts, your ketones go high. By the time it's day 30, which my friends are, way beyond, we've entered the second month of the hunger strike, their joints are now at a point where it's done irreversible damage to their joints. There are sort of health statistics here that will never recover. Like, they've harmed their bodies permanently.
The strikers are making several demands, including immediate bail, an end to the censorship of their communications and the deprescription of Palestine action. And the hunger strike is part of a larger campaign in which 40 MPs have now signed an early day motion expressing concern over the action. Constituency MPs for the hunger striking prisoners have also written to Justice Secretary David Lammy about their cases. But earlier this week, he appeared not to know.
There's been 4 weeks of hunger strikes. Why have you said nothing? Why have you said nothing?
My name is Shamina. I'm a sister of one of the hunger strikers. We have been waiting to respond and the Minister of Justice to respond. There's 7 hunger strikers in the UK right now. They have 5 people. We've got the letter for you. We'll be waiting for a response. My brother is on now day 25. I know they wrote to you about October, end of October. Joanna has been written to as well, and the Minister of Justice. This is 5
Come on, David, let's go.
And we're like in the UK.
I don't know anything about this. I mean, that's really not an excuse. Like, he's the Justice Secretary. If there are people on hunger strike in protest, the largest hunger strike since the 80s, he should know about it. But he doesn't. Or, I mean, that's probably more just an excuse because he doesn't want to talk about it. Dr. James Smith, an NHS doctor who's been supporting the families of the hunger strikers, told The Observer, quote, "This is a trajectory that ends with death." And he went on to describe inadequate care in the prison, saying this: "I'm most concerned about the substandard treatment in the prison system. If someone's on a hunger strike, the obvious thing is that they need to be weighed every single day. From the information I'm receiving from the families, it doesn't appear to me that there has been, for most of them, a single day in which they have had a full set of their observations taken. Heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar levels, proper weights. It can't be overstated that they've not been convicted of anything." Let me just say that again. None of those involved in the strike have been convicted of anything. Of course, a reminder, Palestine Action is now a prescribed organisation under British anti-terrorism law. That's the first domestic direct action group to have been banned in this country. That means expressing support for the group is a criminal offence under terror law. But it's legal to say this: the ban on Palestine Action is fundamentally wrong. Detaining people without trial for months and years for non-violent action is wrong. And this hunger strike, just like everything else to do with Israel and Palestine, it should be a stain on the record of this Labour government. Is this the most important government policy in the world right now? The Australian government's ban on social media for under-16s has just come into force. The tech giants, of course, are furious, but it could just rescue the mental health of a generation. And this is Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
This is the day when Australian families are taking back power from these big tech companies, and they're asserting the right of kids to be kids and for parents to have greater peace of mind.
Such a good message, right? From Keir Starmer's looking for a message. I am taking on the tech companies to defend the childhood of your kids. I don't know why every government in the world isn't doing this, I suppose, unless they're in the pockets of the tech companies. In a separate video, Albanese had this message for Australia's young people ahead of their summer holidays, which are just coming up.
Above all, make the most of the school holidays coming up rather than spending it scrolling on your phone. Start a new sport, learn a new instrument, or read that book that has been sitting there on your shelf for some time. And importantly, spend quality time with your friends and your family, face to face. Have a great summer.
Such a good message. Like, it's a radical policy, right? You're taking on the big tech companies, but it's such a normie message. Like, we want to bring back childhood. Go out, play with your friends, stop staring at your screen, read a book, right? Let's rescue childhood. The ban will mean that under-16s in Australia are now banned from using major social media sites, including TikTok, X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, and Threads. Apparently, they can add to that list at any point in time if it's the case that sort of a new social media app comes along and becomes incredibly popular. This is how it will work. This text is from the BBC. Children and parents will not be punished for infringing the ban. Instead, social media companies face fines of up to £25 million for serious or repeated breaches. The government says firms must take reasonable steps to keep kids off their platforms and should use multiple age assurance technologies. These could include government IDs, face or voice recognition, or so-called age inference, which analyses online behaviour and interactions to estimate a person's age. Platforms cannot rely on users self-certifying or parents vouching for their children. The ban is very popular with parents, polls very well, but it does divide young people. The BBC spoke to 3 teenagers with differing views.
They see social media as a place kind of like a cesspool of the internet where all kinds of debauchery happens and just general nonsense influencing their children, which is true, but that could be bettered with like regulation over complete banning.
I feel like it would be good for people to know there's life outside of social media, like everything on social media isn't real.
Kids are going to find a way to get around it and are going to still access social media even with a ban in place.
I love the kid who said, you know, adults, they think it's this cesspit where all the worst elements of humanity just sort of come to the fore. And they're right. People know that what they're looking at is horrible. I mean, he was in favour of regulation. I mean, as I say, I'm in favour of the ban. I think Helena disagrees, so we'll sort of hash that out in a moment. The push for the ban started with a drive from the Premier of South Australia, who said he was alerted to the problems caused by social media by his wife, who was reading The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt. He's been on Downstream. He has welcomed the ban. So he said, it's happening. Australia is freeing kids under 16 from the social media trap where all kids feel they must be on it because all other kids are on it. Praise to the Premier of South Australia who got it started and to the Prime Minister who took it national. The key, as both men have emphasised, is that we want kids to have fun, exciting childhoods, doing things with friends in the real world. That's the childhood we older people remember fondly. That's the childhood that Gen Z has seen only in movies, and they long for it. I urge Australian parents to make this transition one that their kids will look back to fondly as the summer when their lives opened up. The summer when they were given more freedom and they began to have more unsupervised fun and adventure together. They began to have childhoods worth remembering. Thank you, Australia, for having the guts to go first. There will surely be difficulties in the early months, but the world is rooting for your success and many other nations will follow. It's important to say that sort of Jonathan Haidt, when he's talking about, and you saw that in that comment there, when he's talking about social media, he's not just saying, get rid of social media and then the kids will be fine. He thinks we've had a real problem of over-coddling kids and not letting them go out and explore and take risks. I think he's into sort of free-range parenting. So he just wants you to send out your kid, let them have a good time, get them off the phones. I love this policy. Helena, as I said, I saw on social media today, you disagree. So why do you think this ban is the wrong decision?
Well, I think that we can all agree that there are plenty of negative externalities that are related to social media. We can all agree that this has negative effects on children, but it also has negative effects on adults as well. I take issue with Albanese saying, well, we're taking on the big tech companies to protect children. I'm like, well, you're not actually taking on the big tech companies if you're not influencing all of those things that they do that's created this bad thing in the first place. You're just age gatekeeping when people start accessing all of those bad things. If we really want to take on the big tech companies, we have to look at how they have created those algorithms in the first place. All of those things that negatively affect children, like the way it affects people's body image and the way that it's created a competitive culture between people based upon the portrait of themselves that they can put to the world by using social media, whether it's radicalizing people with online algorithms that directs people towards extreme content, that they are materially incentivized to do so because the incentive that's created this problem is the need to keep people's attention to target adverts. It's why it's addictive. It's why that it makes sure that people engage in contentious debate rather than something a little bit more nuanced and more productive, is because it's that contention that keeps people hooked so that they can target more adverts at you. Bo Burnham has a really good thing talking about this, how like they're trying to colonize your time essentially. They know that that's the one commodity that they can access more than everybody else. And so the algorithms are very, very specifically designed so that you're looking at their app, you're first of all looking at your phone and you're looking at their app over the other apps by ensuring that you maintain that level of engagement. And that problem is seen across all generations. And I would say if we're going to talk about the negative effects of social media on children, which again, we all agree that there is, broadly we agree that there is, why are we not talking about this effect that it's had on people who aren't digital natives who are older? Now, I think the millennials have a pretty healthy relationship with the internet because we grew up with it when the kind of nascent stage of the internet became more popular in the 2000s. But there is a very large segment of the population who didn't grow up with social media, who in fact only really started interacting with social media during the pandemic, and there is no policy to deal with these problems, which again, as far as I am concerned, comes down to this conflict between what is a broader interest of society to maintain the level of connectivity that I believe social media can do good things for. It can create communities of people with like-minded interests. You can share culture with people from across the world. You can use things like YouTube to have educational resources, which kids would be really good to have access to. But we need to actually look at curtailing the interest of these companies to get you hooked, to make you an addict. And that's a problem no matter what your age is. And it's clear what we've seen with a lot of, I hate to say it, people get mad at me for doing generational conflict again, but I believe this to be true, that there is boomer radicalization coming because we don't police social media algorithms enough from first principles, is kind of putting the cart before the horse here. I think that we can certainly look at regulating how young people interact with social media. We can certainly look at seeing how we can age gate certain aspects. But a blanket ban, I fundamentally disagree with. There's a really great YouTuber in Australia. He's called Leo Puglisi. He started what's known as Channel 6 News, which has become famous because they have gotten high-profile interviews with the Prime Minister, with the leader of the opposition, both before Albanese became Prime Minister and afterwards. He's been doing this since he's been age 13, 14, I believe. Under these current rules, he would not have been able to be the kid who was so interested in politics, he created his own news channel at age 14, were it because of this ban. And he's spoken very eloquently, both in The Guardian, he's spoken to CNN on why he thinks that it's a bad thing. But none of us think that we should just be letting kids roam on social media willy-nilly and not look at protections, right? But it has to come from first principles and locking in the problems that social media creates for everybody, rather than just saying, well, we'll just age gate it and then leave it there. That's the issue that I have, because it both takes children away from the benefits of social media whilst leaving all the bad things for everybody else. That's my position.
Okay, I've got a lot of responses I want to make. First, though, because it's interesting, you're a UK Green. The Australian Greens agree with you. So there was sort of cross-party support for this ban. The two main parties in Australia supported it. But opposition did come from the Australian Greens. So this was their spokesperson speaking against the ban last year.
Well, we're worried that this is a blunt instrument that's not actually going to make the platform safer, isn't going to make being on the internet for kids or young people safer, or anyone for that matter. And look, I'm a mum. I've got a teenage daughter. She just graduated this week from Year 12. Hi, darling.
Congrats.
But so I know what it's like to be, as a parent, trying to work out where the limits are. How do you educate? How do you put in place some safety mechanisms? How do you have a conversation with your kids about what is going on and are they able to see the red flags? But just kicking young people off social media until they're 16 and then dropping them in the deep end with no guardrails, no lifeguards, no skills to deal with it is really not the answer. And of course, these big tech companies, what they don't want government doing is going to the heart of their business model. What young people offer these companies is their data. They have targeted advertising directly to them. They're targeted with advertising, dangerous algorithms. That's all the stuff that drives the massive profits for these big companies.
I'll come to. So that was Sarah Hanson-Young from the Australian Greens. I suppose I'll argue against Sarah and Helena, and then go back to you, Helena. I suppose the argument that both of you made and that's being made by the Australian Greens, to me, it just seems a bit like making the perfect the enemy of the good. Obviously, this doesn't solve the problem of social media. But if people don't join when they're teenagers and instead join when they're adults, I think that's better than them joining when they're teenagers. Like you could say the same thing about alcohol, right? You could say, well, maybe we should ease kids into drinking. But I actually think banning people from buying it from the age of 18 is probably right. Like I drank when I was younger, but maybe I would have drunk more if I could just buy it from the shop. Like I think that barrier is good. Obviously, some teenagers are still going to go on social media, but I think having a barrier is good. And I suppose what I think is so strong about a ban is just the way it could shape norms, right? Because I do think we need to start talking about social media like cigarettes. Like it is really something that is doing significant damage to our brains. And when you look at all the statistics, like so many things have collapsed since everyone got smartphones. Like health, anxiety, our happiness, it's all gone down. The birth rate's gone down, which I think is pretty much correlated with when everyone got phones. And I think it's a big problem. And this idea that, I'm not sure if you were quite making this point, but the Australian Green was making the point, was to say, what we really need to do is regulate the harmful content. I don't think the biggest issue with phones is that kids will see stuff they shouldn't see. Like I think kids watching porn is bad and terrible, and not good for the mind, not good for society. I want to stop it. But I think the much bigger problem is kids having this profile where they're constantly trying to curate how they look, and then being addicted to a screen. Like, my social life would be more interesting if I wasn't constantly looking at my phone. When I watch films from the 90s or the noughties, I'm like, God, that looks fun. And I think we should, as much as possible, at least give kids more chance to know what life is like without a smartphone. Obviously, this isn't banning smartphones. I think we should discourage parents from giving their kids anything other than a dumb phone, because then even if you get a VPN, all you can do is, I think the dumb phone gives you podcasts, maps, then you can call your mum, text your friends. But I suppose the other reason I like this is because, what the Australian Green is saying, it's all about data protection, it's all about profit, it's very engaging on all the left-coded bits. I really like that this is I think it's progressive, but it's not politically obvious what this is aligned with, which I think is one reason why Jonathan Haidt has been so successful. It's we are doing this for kids, for parents. It doesn't have to be left-wing or right-wing. It's just in everyone's interest. It's common sense. Let's do it. Okay, Helena, you respond. Sorry, I went on for a while there.
That's fine. That's a perfectly reasonable response. But I think with those two things, you make kind of broader points there, was the issue is kind of a technological one, and that there's this comparison with alcohol and cigarettes. I'll tackle the latter first, which is that I think why this analogy doesn't work is that, I guess this is probably my opinion really, why I don't think this analogy works, is I can't think of any positives out of alcohol and cigarettes, right? People engage in them, as far as I can see, entirely to their detriment. And we age gate them specifically because if people want to, fuck themselves up with these things, then that's their liberty to be able to do so. But we want to stop kids from doing something that we think is just kind of prima facie bad. And I agree with that kind of framework personally. I think cigarettes and alcohol are awful. I don't either of them myself. And whilst I would never want to stop anybody from doing them themselves, if they want to do so, it's up to them. I wouldn't give any kind of positives that we would have for letting children interact with these at all whatsoever. Whereas I think that's not true with social media. I think there are reasonable things that kids do get out of social media, a level of connectivity, which they wouldn't otherwise get access to. Again, learning resources and learning materials that you can use, get access to, right? I don't know where I would be if I wasn't able to watch documentaries on YouTube. I don't know where I'd be if I didn't have this gigantic free library of educational tools, which I use myself, and I still accessed when I was a kid, at least not to the same extent, to be able to learn more. That massive resource is something that's really important to me. And what Leo Puglisi from Channel 6 News says specifically is that, kids are actually getting well educated on news and current events because they're interacting with it on social media. And if there would be no way they would interact with the news at all were they not able to do that. And so I think that there are some positives for kids being on social media that can be mitigated if we had very heavy regulation on what I think is the real problem here, which isn't the phones, it's not the technology, in my opinion. I understand what you mean. It's very left-coded for me to say this, but I believe it to be true. And I think that it is the huge, big tech mega profits that are the problem here. It is the fact that we are allowing not just our kids, but whole societies to be shaped by what are the interests of the shareholders of Meta and of I forget what the name of the parent company, ByteDance, of TikTok. And that's not what I think we should be using these things for. I think that we need to have heavy regulation so that we can prioritize the interests of people over the interests of big tech profits. And throwing the baby out with the bathwater by just doing these blanket bans, I think that's an overreach that I wouldn't want to see. I do agree with the senator as well in the education needs to be something we really need to have. We need to be trying to get schools to do, but also parents to do, to not just teach kids about the evils of social media and the things that they should be avoiding, but the internet more broadly, right? Social media is only one small part of a broader morass of issues that we have with internet access. And I think, again, blunt instruments, as we've seen with these bans, or the Online Safety Act, I don't think have been, I don't agree with their implementation, should I say. Again, because I think we all agree with the broader problem here. I don't think any of us are saying that social media is just prima facie totally fine. None of us think that this is the case. We're just disagreeing over the course of action.
Okay, some disagreements. I think there definitely are upsides to alcohol. Cigarettes less so. Although I think people, it was always a nice way for people to meet each other in smoking areas. But the downsides definitely outweigh that. Alcohol, I think, was good for my social life when I was younger. To be honest, actually, Grindr was as well. I mean, but I got that when I was actually like 20 or something. I definitely didn't need it when I was 14. Where are we? Sorry, I got sidetracked there. Reading. So we can all bring up anecdotes of how sort of like for some people, they got interested in a particular topic via using social media and now they feel smarter. But like public policy has to be based on data and aggregates. And what the aggregates are showing is that people's reading skills have collapsed since everyone got smartphones. Like PISA scores have gone down dramatically, and it happened before COVID. And the mechanism to me seems quite clear, which is that everyone's concentration is shorter. I spend 6 hours a day or something, like it's ridiculous looking at this. And that's normal, right? That's maybe 4, I'm not sure. For a while it was like 8. I think I have got it down quite a lot because I deleted Twitter and Instagram from my phone, which are incredibly addictive. But it seems with all of these things, you are seeing arrow going direction, reading going down, mechanism obvious. And as to sort of, we should make more fundamental changes to social media. Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally in favor of that. But it would seem sensible to say, well, we're going to work out how we can make social media less toxic and addictive. But while we're doing that, we won't give it to the kids. We'll do that experiment, because this is a big, massive experiment. We'll do that big, massive experiment on adults. And then if we really think we've got it right, we'll give the phones back to the kids. But I mean, for me, I think the evidence seems to suggest that you take the phone off the kid, and so long as they've got a lot of friends who are also off the phone, they're going to have a better time. Which is why Jonathan Haidt's always talking about sort of the collective action problem with this, which is that sort of everyone wants to be off their phone, but they can't be off their phone because all their friends are on it. And I think parents have a similar thing with kids, which is they say they don't want their kid to be on the phone, but then they feel bad because all the kids' friends are on the phone. So sort of the government has stepped in and done what I think governments really should do, which is solve a collective action problem. I'll give you the final word on this, Helena.
And I think we've teased out the disagreements that we have on this one pretty fairly already, so I'll leave it to you.
Well, we'll leave it to the audience to decide. That was your debate on whether or not we should ban social media. Helena, it's been fabulous being joined by you this evening.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to tomorrow where I'll be hosting.
Fantastic. And you'll be in this seat, and you might actually have Aaron in person, I'm not sure. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.